Well, it gives people an alternative. It gives them something else to do. They can look back into the way it used to be, the way Mother Nature had created part of it, and basically find a serenity and inner peace there. There are just things about being out here that you just won't find down on the pavement.
It's not trampled by man and the things he tends to do at times in the name of progress or economics, and not necessarily knocking the fact that we do need to eat, we need to drive our vehicles, and we need to do all these things, but we don't necessarily need to do them everywhere. And a protected area such as this would provide the opportunity just to get away and have the peace and serenity that we all enjoy at one time or another.
I think we have a moral obligation to protect areas where all species can make it. You know, we shouldn't be so self-centered to think that we're the most important thing around. There's a lot of other creatures that deserve that space out there too.
For me, it's a chance to reflect on the challenges that I seem to yearn when I'm out in the environment. I look at the wilderness as a place to be challenged, a place to be afraid, a place to perhaps have really private thoughts, and a place to discover my own inner self, where I can call home.
Where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Hi, I'm Bruce Reichert, and welcome to Outdoor Idaho. With those words written 25 years ago, America became the first country in the world to make wilderness preservation national policy. What that has meant for Idaho is about 4 million acres of protected wilderness. But scattered throughout Idaho is about 9 million acres of unprotected wilderness. And this is the crux of the Idaho wilderness debate. How much of this land should we formally protect? Here's what we have now, about 4 million acres. This is what Senator McClure and Governor Andrus are proposing, to add 1.4 million more acres as protected wilderness. And this is what some groups like the Idaho Conservation League and the Wilderness Society are suggesting, to add 4 million more acres as designated wilderness. In many ways, wilderness is a state of mind, and consequently it defies easy definition. But it is not kind, it is not gentle, it is not safe. It is wild, untamed country, occasionally hostile and fearsome, and quite capable of instilling a sense of awe and humility.
If you think about who we are and how the West and the Americas, the Southwest, the Northlands, etc., were settled, that created a character in the American immigrant at that time. And I think we have to preserve that opportunity for our offspring to see what wild lands once looked like, what some of the challenges were. How do you do things the hard way? And what are some of the extremes? Surprise, discovery, adventurism, self-reliance. These are all things that if we're not careful, we could lose those skills. And more importantly, you have, from that day on, roadless land. Not all the land in America will be occupied and roaded for the purposes of exploitation.
It took 9 long years of compromise to hammer out a bill acceptable to all sides. But the real beginning of wilderness is buried somewhere in the vision of National Forest Service folks such as Gifford Penshaw and Aldo Leopold, who had the foresight to set aside large, rugged areas that would remain wild.
I don't think anybody in the 30s, when all this really occurred, these primitive areas were set up in the 30s, really envisioned a national preservation network. So I would say that both by design and somewhat by accident, large blocks of land were left intact to be used as instant wildernesses in the '64 Act.
Idaho played a big part in the push for wilderness. The old primitive area known as the Selway Bitterroot was one of the first to become instant wilderness. With the help of Idaho Senator Frank Church, one of the primary sponsors of the bill, 1.3 million acres of wildlands along Idaho's northern Rocky Mountain spine was designated wilderness.
Nature there was rolling the dice. When 64 rolled around, you had a situation, a laboratory, so to speak, that had no special interest eager to exploit it. No mining existed. The sheep and cattle grazing was already phased out by 1964 because the economics changed. The grizzly bear was gone. The salmon and steelhead runs were destroyed by all sorts of interest, downstream interest. There was no large timber volumes that needed removal for supporting towns or supporting new industries. All those things came into focus at once in 1964, and they said, hey, piece of land's available. Let's call it wilderness. Let's make that an example. And it was a good one, because it was relatively clean and unused and not particularly abused.
Since the designation of the Selway Bitterroot, Idaho has added another 2.8 million acres of wilderness. The Gospel Hump, Hell's Canyon, the Sawtooth, and the largest wilderness in the lower 48 states, the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. Idaho seems blessed with a plethora of wild places, rugged, mysterious country that pulls at something primitive in ourselves. But it also repels. It can be frightening and intimidating.
Wilderness is a paradox. Wilderness does not mean comfort, convenience, and economy. It means just the opposite. So the confusion among our citizens is one of, why would we want to punish ourselves by setting aside land that treats us very poorly when we use it? We get cold, we get lost, we can't harvest and manipulate the products. I think there's a sense of perhaps not growing up yet mentally about a balanced Idaho. Sure, you know, Idaho has got to worry about its future, any state does, and has anybody sat down to talk about what that might mean 200 years from now?
That question is a major concern of Grant Simons and Doug Timms of the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association. They estimate 60 to 70% of their licensed outfitters derive a significant portion of their income from the 4 million acres of designated wilderness.
Well, we estimate that national forest lands and wilderness in this state directly and indirectly employ around 1,100 outfitters or guides. Hey, the wilderness resource forms the backbone for our industry, and that is quality wildlife resources and clean, clear, unobstructed streams are what are the bottom line for outfitting and guiding in the state. That's what the person who enjoys a backcountry wilderness experience with an outfitter comes to Idaho for.
Over 90,000 clients participated in outfitted activities during the 1986-87 season, according to this industry report. That adds up to an estimated $45.5 million impact on the state of Idaho, in such things as client fees, user fees, taxes, hunting and fishing licenses, lodging, supplies, and groceries. But spectacular scenery, untamed rivers, and abundant wildlife translate into more than dollars and cents. The resource is the draw, and preserving and maintaining Idaho's backcountry is of primary importance to the folks who call this their office, whether they be outfitters or land managers.
The attitudes have changed a lot towards partnership and realize that we really both have the same goals. And if you look at it even closer, you'll find that we're both in that business for the same reason. A manager, a Forest Service person, or a BLM person, they want to be in that position working at the field level because they love that country, and so does that outfitter. And they both want it to be something that will be there in the future for their families, for their children and their children's children.
The 1964 bill says that wilderness areas be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people in such a manner as will leave them unimpaired for future use and enjoyment as wilderness. To Idaho's outfitters, the best part of the job is sharing the wilderness with their guests.
People just don't believe this kind of country still exists. It really is. It's fascinating to them that within the continental United States, they can still come to a place where there's 6,000 square miles of designated wilderness. In addition to that, you've got, another 9 million roadless acres in this state that most people perceive as wilderness, whether it's designated or not. Edward Abbey said that the wilderness is a psychiatric refuge for the country. And indeed, you see that in the benefit that people who come and access this land and use it, to really appreciate the value of it, you need to be there.
36-year-old Tom Stevens appreciates Idaho's wilderness. Once an avid hunter and athlete, Tom has spent the last 5 years battling multiple sclerosis. But thanks to volunteer backcountry pilots, this day Tom had a chance to get reacquainted with the quiet beauty of the Chamberlain Basin, part of the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness.
This is what it's all about. I mean, being able to get back in. I mean, so I may be in a wheelchair, but being able to just get back in and do the things that you used to do, and just because you have a disease of some sort, of any kind, or disability of any kind, and being able to allow it to get back in and feel like a normal person, that's what it's all about.
Flying, rafting, kayaking, hiking, horseback, all methods folks use to get into Idaho's wilderness areas. Although the reasons for going may vary, the instinct for preserving wilderness remains the same.
It's not going to stay a wilderness if they don't clean it up, It's everybody's probably responsibility to clean up after themselves if you don't treat your house like that, so you don't, make a mess out in the woods either.
Ken and Rita Buck, their kids, and Llama Leroy hiked into the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness area. Don McPherson's favorite form of transportation is horseback and mule train. This romantic image of traditional mountain travel has its flaws, and Don's group, the Backcountry Horsemen, are trying to educate folks on maintaining and preserving trails and campsites.
We work with the land managers on projects to open trails, build hitch racks, trailhead facilities, bridges. In the past, horsemen have had a real bad name, and it's been brought on by improper handling, tying stock to trees, tying them too close to streams or lakes. Animals who will paw, pull back, dig out the root system and kill the trees. They'll eat all the vegetation near the lakes, rendering the shores unsightly and cause erosion. I'm probably one of the best supporters of the original wilderness bill when it was proposed back 25 years ago or more. And my main thrust is we should be able to use it and not abuse it.
For some, like the Buck family, it's the fishing that makes wilderness special. An avid angler himself, fisheries manager L. Van Vuren understands the magnetism of a pristine mountain lake.
And we have two obligations. We have an obligation to protect the resource, make sure the resource is here. And then we have a second obligation to provide for the type of fishing that the angler in Idaho wants. Idaho offers a very unique type of fishing experience, and fishing is an experience, and that is the wilderness fishing experience. In untouched country where you feel like you could be the only person who's been there, where you're not constantly reminded of the world you left for that experience, where there's not the sound of a log truck or a chainsaw, or there's not a heifer watching you fish. So that type of experience is something we need to preserve, and I'd hate to think we'd ever get to the point where you can't find that very special fishing experience.
It's not only Idahoans who treasure a secluded stream. Non-resident anglers contributed almost $2 million in licenses and tags alone to Idaho's economy. Research studies show that the West Slope cutthroat prefer wilderness areas too. This map shows the range of strong populations of this native game fish. It corresponds directly to designated and recommended wilderness.
The reason for that is a couple of reasons. One, cutthroat are very sensitive to habitat impacts, sedimentation that results from any kind of land disturbing activity. And they're also very susceptible to overfishing. So wherever we have road access, we get more fishing pressure, and cutthroat are very vulnerable.
Vulnerability is the key reason that wilderness is important to many of Idaho's big game animals.
We find that roaded areas, that animals are more vulnerable because more people can get into them. Oftentimes they've had some sort of land treatment like logging, where it opens up the timber and makes them more visible. Carrying it to the other extreme, the furthest extreme, is designated wilderness, and that's where we find the animals not necessarily having the greatest amount of protection, but the lower vulnerabilities to hunting, because fewer people are willing to go into those areas and to hunt those areas, so the animals have more protection.
Research biologist John Beecham argues that the wilderness we have today is chosen more for its scenic merits than its habitat value to wildlife.
No, I'm not saying that it doesn't benefit wildlife, but what I am saying is that people have to recognize that not all wilderness is a benefit to wildlife. As you can see, as human populations grow and habitats become fragmented, that those populations begin to disappear, with few exceptions. Some very adaptable species that have learned to coexist with man. So I think there's a very, very strong argument to be made for larger wildernesses, larger protected areas, if you will, because what that means is a higher probability of survival for the larger mammals that we have in our state.
It's not only the game animals that benefit from wilderness areas. The job of research biologist Craig Groves is to study the animals that aren't hunted, Idaho's non-game wildlife.
Examples, some of our endangered species like grizzly bears and caribou, wolves, and some of our state species of special concern like wolverines and lynx, species like that. They have really large home ranges and they need undisturbed habitat, and the only places that they're going to make it are in wilderness areas or roadless areas, or areas that we hope will someday become wilderness areas.
The wilderness is important to both John Beecham and Craig Groves as researchers in that it gives them a control area, a baseline to compare the impacts of disturbances by mankind.
Of course, every species needs certain types of habitat requirements. The caribou, for example, are not very tolerant of human disturbance, and for the last 3 or 4 years I've been working on a species of ducks, harlequin ducks, that nests on mountain streams, and they only prefer really undisturbed, pristine, high water quality types of streams. And the only place that we're really finding those is in either wilderness areas or, for the most part, in undisturbed areas.
It's this kind of research that brings home to all of us the necessity of wilderness. But it's more than a laboratory. It's a place that dances with our soul, frees our senses, supplies the solitude that triggers emotional well-being.
It has to have some wild characteristics, rare species like the grizzly bear or caribou, things that you don't see in very many places in the state. Peregrine falcons, those kinds of things. If they need habitat that's largely undisturbed, then that's what I need, because I need to see those things. I'm not content to see them in a zoo.
Wilderness and the wilderness debate has also created efficiency. And nowhere is that efficiency more evident than here at the Boise Cascade Sawmill in Horseshoe Bend.
So they went with the most modern technology that was available. Everything is computer run now. We have a computer scanner that scans the boards and decides what it should make out of it for the best dollar value and the most volume that it will get out of it. Every bit of that log gets used. The sawdust, all the waste wood is made into chips to make into paper, so that even the bark we use to make electricity with.
To folks like Steve Bliss, an 18-year veteran with Boise Cascade, wilderness is a land of no use. That's because logging activities are incompatible with wilderness.
What we should be doing is looking at better ways of managing the ground, not to lock it up behind a gate or take it out of complete use where only a few people can use it. We still should have it so that the most people can use it.
To sawmill workers, additional wilderness means just one thing: fewer trees and fewer jobs.
I can't actually pin down which jobs will be lost or how many jobs will be lost, and I really don't want to put that on the McClure-Andrus bill. Let's just say additional wilderness acres in Idaho will cost jobs in the forest industry. That I can guarantee you.
I think a lot of people think that the forest products industry is completely opposed to wilderness, and that's not the case. I think resource managers are concerned about wilderness being a very restrictive prescription for land management. And as a result, the extent of land that you set aside for wilderness, I think, is of real concern.
But sometimes nature has her own agenda. Lightning is the cause of most fires in wilderness. While many of us may see only waste and destruction here, this is the beginning, not the end, for many plants.
Right here, coming up out of the burnt ground from last year, you can see these little seedlings, which are red-stem ceanothus. This is a particularly important and sought-after species for elk. This is a serviceberry that was killed in the fire last July, and you can see how tall it was. This is not a very decadent one, but it's one that was a lot out of the reach of the elk. And what happened is it killed the top, yet caused the base to resprout, and this is all resprouting serviceberry here, which is now, as you can see, very available to the elk.
This is what fire managers like to see after a wilderness fire: a mosaic of burned and unburned timber, fingers of green amidst the black. In a year or two, these burned areas will support more game than before the fire. It's a cycle that has continued for centuries, with various plants and animals having their moment of glory. But that's a concept that Smokey the Bear did not prepare us for. Tom Patton, one of the originators of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness Fire Plan.
And we had to change some thinking. Even in service, we had to change thinking on people's parts on the fact that possibly fire could do a beneficial thing within the wilderness, and it was part of the natural process. Yeah, it was very difficult to get over that Smokey the Bear syndrome. I think we've come a long way in the last 5 or 6 years on educating people the differences between which fires are good and which fires can be beneficial in the right circumstances.
But sometimes, in particularly dry years, a wilderness fire can burn too hot. 1 year after lightning torched 50,000 acres in central Idaho, we returned to assess the damage.
It's pretty barren and desolate because this was really a hot burn in here. And then if you look down there, there's a creek down there. I mean, it looks like a creek, but it used to be the trail. And so when you get any kind of a rainfall through this particular area, it's going to be a real washout.
But it'll be 7 years before you really have anything to cover the site that'll protect it from the standpoint of wild game use, the rodent population coming back that puts, and the small birds and that kind of thing that gets a micro ecosystem going. It'll be a good 7 years before that happens, and it may or may not even happen here, depending on how intense it was.
When faced with walls of fire burning out of control in rugged backcountry, the notion that humans can somehow manage fires in wilderness areas might seem a bit naive. But special provisions of the Wilderness Act allow for firefighting, insect, and disease control. And in the Frank Church Wilderness, prescribed management fires purposely set to eliminate fuel buildups are also permitted.
Where you can look at suppressing a fire outside the wilderness, say a 1,000-acre fire for somewhere around, depending on where you're at, $500 to $1,000 an acre, that could sometimes double within a wilderness. So it can get very, very expensive.
But deciding how and when to manage fires in wilderness areas is only part of the complex job of managing the largest wilderness in the lower 48. Rafters on the main and middle fork of the Salmon River obtain permits before embarking on their wilderness experience, while at the same time there is unrestricted jet boat use on the main Salmon, and scattered throughout the wilderness are over 20 airstrips.
Well, they bother me as a purist, yes, but we had to allow those. That was part of the price to get the rest of it, and the value of the whole thing far outweighed what those concessions that had to be made.
Furthermore, certain pre-existing uses like livestock, grazing, and hunting and fishing were allowed to continue. That Idaho hunters appreciate the wilderness experience is obvious from a study released earlier this week. Over half of Idaho's deer hunters preferred hunting in areas without roads, while over 90% listed off-road vehicles as the leading distraction of their hunting experience. So what is the legacy of Idaho wilderness? To some, it will always be a land of no use, a land locked up for the fortunate few. But for people like Ernie Day and others who have spent the better part of their lives fighting for wilderness, it is a natural museum, a place to find humility and serenity.
We still have time and we still have the resource, and I hope we have the sense to save it for future generations, because it will be more necessary for our psyche and more necessary for our pocketbook both as time wears on.